How could one of the warmest family photographs ever found also be hiding signs of fear in plain sight? And why did everything about that smiling mother change the moment someone noticed what was happening to both of her hands? If stories like this stay with you long after the video ends, tap like, subscribe for more hidden history mysteries, and share this with someone who always sees the detail everybody else ignores. At first, the picture looked almost too tender to be tragic. A mother stood on a porch in the summer of 1926. Three children pressed close against her. One boy stood tall at her side, trying to look older than he was. Another leaned in with the natural trust only a child can give. A little girl rested against her mother as if the safest place in the world was right there, inside those arms. The woman at the center wore a simple dress. Her hair was pinned back. Her smile was bright, open, and full of life. That is exactly what happened the day the portrait surfaced inside a dusty auction house in Portland. The woman who found it was not a historian. She was not a detective. She was not even a collector in the serious sense. She was a retired photographer named Elizabeth Morgan, a woman who had spent most of her life reading faces. For 40 years, she had photographed weddings, graduations, babies, funerals, and family reunions. She knew how people performed happiness for a camera. She also knew how pain leaked through even when people tried to hide it. That instinct is what made her stop. She had been moving through tables stacked with cheap relics and forgotten paper, the kind of leftovers that gather when whole lives are reduced to boxes with price tags. There were postcards, recipe cards, old magazines, receipts, church pamphlets, and loose photographs. Most of them were ordinary. Then her hand landed on one mounted print, larger and better made than the rest. She lifted it into the light, and the first thing she noticed was the love in it. Not staged affection, real affection. The children were relaxed. Their bodies leaned naturally toward the woman. They were not posing around her. They were attached to her. You could see that she was the center of their world. On the back, someone had written only a few words in pencil. Mom and Us, Seattle, June 1926. No last name. No address. No explanation. Just enough to make the image feel intimate, and not enough to tell you who had lived inside it. Elizabeth might have bought the whole box anyway, but then she looked at the woman's wrists. Both sleeves had slipped back just enough to expose dark bands around the skin. Not dirt. Not creases. Not flaws in the print. Bruises. She moved closer to the window. The marks on the left wrist looked deep, almost ring-shaped. On the right, the same pattern appeared again. There was also swelling across the knuckles and faint discoloration along the lower forearms, as if the long sleeves had been chosen very carefully to cover what they could not fully hide. That changed everything. In one instant, the photograph became two images at once. On the surface, it was a mother holding her children in a moment of love. Under the surface, it was a woman trying to stand steady while carrying evidence of violence on her body. And yet her face did not show surrender. That may be the most haunting part of the whole story. She was smiling, not in a fake, frozen, polite way, not with the strained expression people use when they want the moment over. Her smile looked alive, warm, intentional. It was the smile of someone who understood exactly what she wanted the camera to preserve. Elizabeth paid for the box and took it home. Most people would have put the picture on a shelf and left it there as a sad mystery. Elizabeth could not. The more she stared at the image beneath her lamp, the more she became convinced that the woman had not simply been photographed. She had left a message. That idea may sound dramatic, but think about the choices inside the frame. The children are close. The mother's body curves around them. Her injuries are partly hidden but not perfectly hidden. Her expression is determined. The photograph is not luxurious or grand. It looks practical, urgent, almost purposeful, not the kind of portrait made for vanity. The kind made because someone knows a record must exist. Who was she? Why was she hurt? Why did she want this image taken? And why did it feel, even across a century, as if she were trying to tell strangers something her own world refused to hear? Elizabeth had contacts in Washington, including a retired Seattle photojournalist and a historian who specialized in local archives. She sent copies. She made enlargements of the hands, the children's faces, the porch, the house behind them, the curtains in the windows, even the angle of the steps. Old photographs can be stingy with names, but generous with clues. And still the children looked cared for. That matters. Poverty leaves traces, neglect leave. Ease traces, but so does devotion. Whoever this woman was, she had made sure her children were clean, close, and calm. Whatever fear existed in that house, it had not taken away her instinct to protect them. A few days later, the first real breakthrough came from Seattle. A historian there located the records of a traveling photographer who worked neighborhood family portraits during the 1920s. She had kept session ledgers. Names were not always complete, but the dates, neighborhoods, fees, and little notes often were. Buried among many ordinary entries was one from June 18, 1926. The description matched. A woman with 3 children. A session at a residence in Georgetown. Long sleeves despite warm weather. Visible bruising on the wrists and arms. Urgency about receiving the prints quickly. And one line that changed the emotional weight of the whole case. The photographer noted that the woman wanted the children to remember her smiling. Not to remember the day. Not to remember the weather. Not to remember the house. To remember her smiling. That is not a casual request. That is the language of someone thinking about memory in advance. Someone planning for absence. Someone already imagining a future in which the children might need proof of what love looked like on her face. Now the portrait no longer felt like a family keepsake alone. It felt like preparation. It felt like a mother creating one clear image for the people she feared she might leave behind. When the historian followed the address through police and newspaper records, the case turned darker still. 3 days after the portrait was taken, a man living in that house died from a fall down the basement stairs. His name was Robert. The woman in the photograph was his wife, Helen. The children were William, James, and Mary. The official finding was accidental death. But neighbors had heard fighting. Some had reported noise before the incident. And when the story was compared with the bruises in the photograph, the official version no longer felt complete. That is the point where many stories become sensational. People jump too quickly. They decide the ending first and force every fact to serve it. But this case is more powerful if we stay honest. We do not know exactly what happened on those stairs. We do not know whether Helen pushed him in self-defense, whether he fell during a struggle, or whether something else happened in that house after years of violence finally reached a breaking point. What we do know is this. 3 days before Robert died, Helen made sure a photograph existed that showed her with her children, loving them, holding them, and carrying visible injuries on both hands and arms. That is not nothing. That is a statement. And it becomes even more striking when another record surfaced, a private diary entry from the photographer who took the portrait. She wrote that Helen seemed relieved when the prints were delivered. She wrote that Helen held them like treasure. She wrote that Helen said, "Now my children will remember me smiling." Then came the line nobody forgot. According to the diary, when asked if she was all right, Helen replied, "I will be soon. I'll be free." Free. Think about that word. Not happy. Not safe. Free. That is the vocabulary of captivity. It suggests that by June of 1926, Helen no longer thought of her marriage as difficult or troubled. She thought of it as a trap, and whatever decision she had made, she had already made it before the camera shutter clicked. Now step back and picture the emotional force of the moment. A woman in a small Seattle house, bruises on both wrists, 3 young children depending on her, a husband apparently absent during the photo session, a decision forming in her mind, a need to secure one image that would survive whatever came next. No dramatic speech, no public accusation, no courtroom, just a porch, a camera, and a mother choosing what memory she would leave behind. That is why this photograph hits so hard. It is not only evidence of pain, it is evidence of strategy. Helen was thinking ahead. She understood that survival is not only about escaping the moment, it is also about shaping what remains after it. And that raises a painful question. How many women before her never got the chance? How many endured violence in silence because there was nowhere to go, no legal protection that truly worked, no money of their own, no social climate ready to believe them, and no way to prove what life looked like behind the walls of an ordinary house? In 1926, the answer is devastating. For many women, marriage could become a locked system. If the husband controlled the money, the house, the reputation, and the explanation, then even obvious harm could be made invisible. Bruises could be called clumsiness. Fear could be called nerves. A frightened wife could be described as sensitive, unstable, or difficult. Communities often knew more than they admitted, but knowing is not the same as intervening. And that is one of the darkest truths buried inside old family photographs. They do not only show what people wanted to celebrate, they often show what people were trying desperately to survive. If this story already has you looking at old pictures differently, pause for 1 second, hit the like button, subscribe so you do not miss the next hidden story, and send this video to that one friend who always says the smallest detail changes everything. Once researchers identified Helen, the next question was whether she and the children vanished after Robert's death or managed to rebuild their lives somewhere else. The search through census pages and city directories took time. Old records are full of gaps, spelling errors, missing pages, and frustrating dead ends. But eventually the family reappeared in Tacoma. Helen was listed as a widow. Her occupation was seamstress. The children were in school. That may sound like a simple update, but in historical terms it means something powerful. She got out. Whatever happened in that Seattle house, she got out with the children and she kept them together. She was no longer recorded through the identity of the man who hurt her. She was recorded through labor, through work, through survival. Widow, seamstress, mother. That sequence carries its own quiet triumph. It also tells us something about the photograph. It was not made in vain. Helen was not just documenting despair. She was drawing a line between two lives, one before freedom, one after. More records filled in the years that followed. One son became a mechanic, another served in the Navy. The daughter became a teacher. They did not disappear into destitution. They did not collapse into the kind of ruin that abusive homes often try to predict. Instead, they built futures. That does not mean the trauma vanished. It never does. Children raised around violence carry it in ways records rarely capture. They may remember fear in rooms that looked quiet. They may remember footsteps, tones of voice, doors opening too fast, the way a mother's face changed when someone entered the house. They may grow up watchful, alert, mature too early. Even when they escape physically, part of them may keep living inside the old alarm. But they also had something many children of that era did not. They had Helen. Not a perfect life, not protection from every scar, but a mother who looked at danger and still found the strength to center them in her final act before change. She did not create a portrait of herself alone. She built the frame around the children. That matters more the longer you think about it. She was telling them long before they could understand this was the truth bigger than the violence. I loved you. I held you. I kept you close. Years later, one of the children was finally reached. William had seen a notice connected to the search and responded. By then he was an older man. His mother had been gone for years. His brother had also died. His sister lived elsewhere, but he remembered the photograph immediately. Of course he did. In families shaped by hardship, certain images stop being decorations and become anchors. One picture on a dresser can hold more emotional weight than a room full of furniture. William reportedly remembered that the portrait mattered deeply to Mary, the daughter in the image. She kept it because their mother looked happy in it. That detail is heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. As children, they may not have understood what the bruises meant. As adults, they understood the smile. And perhaps that is the exact result Helen wanted. She did not want their strongest memory to be terror. She wanted love to win the frame. Still, once the injuries were pointed out and the timeline reconstructed, the photograph offered them something new, not a replacement memory, a deeper one. It told them that their mother had not merely endured. She had chosen. She had acted with intention. She had protected them with more awareness than they likely knew. There is a tendency when discussing victims from the past to describe them only through suffering. We focus on what was done to them. We freeze them in the moment of pain. But Helen's portrait resists that. Yes, she was injured. Yes, she was almost certainly living under threat. But the image is also a record of agency. She chose the clothes. She chose the children close. She chose the smile. She chose to make the photograph happen before everything changed. That is not passivity. That is courage under pressure. And maybe that is why the picture lingers in the mind more than so many others. It contains two truths at once without letting either erase the other. The first truth is brutal. Violence had entered this home and marked Helen's body. The second truth is stronger. Violence did not succeed in defining what she wanted her children to remember most. You can feel that conflict in the photograph itself. The injuries whisper one story, the embrace LLS another. The smile tells a third, and together they form the kind of emotional complexity that no official report ever could. A police file can list a death. A city directory can list an address. A census can list occupations. But only the portrait can show what love looked like while standing inside danger. That is why images like this matter so much to historians, not because they are pretty, but because they contain evidence no other record knows how to hold. Body language, touch, distance, strain, resolve. A single camera exposure can preserve things language would soften, deny, or erase. In Helen's case, the image also exposes an old social lie. People often imagine abuse as chaotic, obvious, impossible to miss. Sometimes it is, but often it lives inside normal-looking spaces. A plain house, clean children, a smiling wife, a porch in daylight. From the street, everything looks fine. From the photograph, everything looks loving. Only when you move closer do you see the cost of maintaining that appearance. And that is not only a lesson about the 1920s. It is a lesson about human blindness. We are very good at accepting the first version of reality that feels comfortable. A happy family, a simple portrait, an accidental death, a widow moving away. That neat sequence allows the world to move on. But the bruises do not fit the neat sequence. The diary entry does not fit it. Helen's word free does not fit it. Once those details enter the story, the polite version begins to crack. Maybe that is why this case unsettles people so deeply. It reminds us how much suffering can exist inside images we are trained to trust. Family portraits are supposed to reassure us. They are supposed to say, this happened, these people belong together, this moment was worth keeping. But sometimes they do something more dangerous. Sometimes they preserve a contradiction too honest for the people of that era to name. And once future eyes are ready, the contradiction speaks. If this story is hitting you in the chest, leave a comment with the word smile. Subscribe for more stories hidden inside old photos, and share this video with someone who understands that love can look gentle and fierce at the same time. By now, the portrait had become more than a mystery solved. It had become a challenge to the way we read the past. Too often, history is told through official voices, police reports, property records, government forms, newspaper blurbs written in flat, tidy language. Those sources matter, but they are not neutral. They reflect power. They record what institutions choose to notice. They rarely capture what a woman like Helen could not safely say out loud. That is why small personal traces matter so much. A scribbled note on the back of a photograph. A private diary, line from a neighborhood photographer. A bruise that someone once hoped would stay invisible. A child's adult memory of a mother who seemed stronger than words. Put those fragments together, and the past begins to resist simplification. It stops being a closed file. It becomes human again. And that human reality is painful. We can admire Helen's courage without romanticizing what forced it into existence. No woman should have needed that kind of foresight. No mother should have had to build a visual goodbye while still standing in her own home. The fact that she did tells us how narrow her options must have felt. That is part of what makes the image so morally heavy. It is not just a portrait of strength. It is a portrait of a world that demanded strength from the wrong person. The burden should have been on the abuser to stop, on the community to intervene, on the law to protect. Instead, the burden fell on Helen to endure, plan, shield, and somehow keep love visible for the children. And she did. That should not make us comfortable. It should make us honest. There is also the question of why the image survived at all. Old family items are fragile. They disappear in floods, fires, moves, arguments, neglect. Yet this portrait remained. Someone kept it. Someone valued it enough that decades later it still existed, tucked away with other papers instead of destroyed or forgotten entirely. Most likely, the children carried it forward. And that brings us back to the hands. Why do those hands matter so much? Because hands tell stories the face sometimes refuses to tell. Hands hold. Hands shield. Hands work. Hands tremble. Hands bruise. Hands reveal pressure. Helen's face gave the children warmth. Her hands gave the future the truth. Without those marks, the portrait might still be lovely, but it would not have opened this door. Without those marks, Robert's death might remain just another line in an old file. Without those marks, Helen's courage would still exist, but we would have less access to it. The injuries turned sentiment into testimony. And yet even that is not the final lesson. The final lesson is that tenderness and terror can occupy the same frame. That is deeply uncomfortable because we prefer emotional categories to stay separate. We want love pictures to be safe and danger pictures to be obvious. Helen's portrait denies us that comfort. It says a mother can be hurt and heroic in the same moment. It says beauty can coexist with fear. It says the camera may capture both care and emergency without telling you which one to look at first. Maybe that is why the image feels almost alive when people study it now. Not because of superstition, not because of ghosts, because the emotional intention inside it is so concentrated. Helen wanted something from the future. She wanted witnesses who would finally see all of it. And eventually she got them. A retired photographer saw the hands. A historian found the ledgers. A diary gave context. Records tracked the children forward. And one family portrait, nearly lost in a box of cheap paper, became a delayed act of recognition. There is a kind of justice in that, even if it comes too late to punish anyone. Recognition matters. Being seen correctly matters. For victims, for children, for the dead, for history itself, it matters. Because what abuse tries to control more than anything is the story. It does not only injure the body, It tries to define reality. It tries to say this is normal, this is private, this is nothing, this did not happen, you cannot prove it, nobody will believe you. Helen may not have had the power to make the world listen in 1926, but she found a way to leave behind one stubborn piece of visual truth. And that truth waited. Waited through decades. Waited through silence. Waited through death. Waited through dust. Until somebody finally looked long enough. If you've stayed with me to this point, like the video, subscribe for more true stories hidden in plain sight, and share this with one person who knows that the most important evidence is often the thing everybody almost missed. What happened after that matters, but maybe not in the way we usually expect. There was no dramatic court reversal, no headline announcing final justice, no triumphant ending that erases what came before. Real life almost never offers that. What it offered instead was something quieter and maybe more important. The children lived. They grew. They carried Helen with them. One served. One worked with his hands. One taught children and became known for kindness toward the frightened. That detail alone feels like a continuation of the photograph. A child once held by a bruised mother grows up and creates safety for other children. That is how courage survives. Not always through speeches, often through habits of care. Helen herself later died from heart trouble after years of work. There is a sadness in that too. Survival is not the same as ease. Freedom does not refund what violence took. People escape and still pay in exhaustion, illness, nerves, and shortened peace. But the fact that she lived long enough to see her children move forward matters. She did not vanish 3 days after the photo into legend. She crossed the line she had been fighting to reach. That makes the portrait even more extraordinary. It is not a farewell from someone about to disappear forever. It is a bridge, a record from the edge of one life into the beginning of another. And in that sense, the smile becomes almost unbearable in its strength. It was not naive. It was not denial. It was discipline. It was a mother deciding that whatever had happened to her, the picture her children carried should still contain light. I think that is why people respond so strongly to stories like this. Deep down, we recognize the difference between a smile created for approval and a smile created for protection. Helen's was not trying to impress anyone. It was trying to save something. That is what makes it sacred. By the end of the search, the photograph no longer asked only one question. It asked many. How many family images are still sitting in drawers with untold stories inside them? How many people in history were misunderstood because the only records that survived belonged to institutions, not to them? How many acts of courage looked ordinary at the time because nobody knew where to look? And how often do we mistake calm surfaces for peaceful lives? Those questions matter because the past is never only about the past. We still live among polished surfaces. We still reward appearances. We still underestimate what private fear can hide behind a practiced smile. We still need people willing to look closer, ask harder questions, and believe that tenderness does not cancel the possibility of harm. So when you picture that porch now, do not picture a passive victim waiting to be defined by tragedy. Picture Helen as she seems to have truly been in that moment, injured, alert, fiercely loving, and already moving in her mind toward freedom. Picture the children close against her. Picture the quiet intelligence behind the pose. Picture the camera clicking while a hidden PL and was already in motion. That is not weakness. That is resolve. That is a mother turning a simple portrait into a shield that would last longer than fear. And maybe that is the real reason the photograph still feels so powerful now. Not because it shows pain, though it does. Not because it suggests a mystery, though it certainly does. But because it captures one of the hardest truths a person can live. Sometimes love is not soft. Sometimes love is the steady face you put on while building an exit. Sometimes love is what remains visible when everything else in your life is under threat. In the end, people may remember the bruises first. They may remember the discovery, the records, the dead husband, the line about freedom. But I think the deepest part of the story is simpler than that. A mother knew her children might someday need proof. So she gave them proof. Proof that she loved them. Proof that she held them close. Proof that even in danger, she was still thinking about who they would become after her. And more than 100 years later, that proof is still doing its work.